Full on this casement shone the wintry moon, and threw warm gules on Madeline's fair breast, as down she knelt for heaven's grace and boon. Rose bloom fell on her hands together pressed, and on her silver cross soft amethyst, and on her hair a glory like a saint. She seemed a splendid angel newly dressed, save wings for heaven. Porphyro grew faint. She knelt so pure a thing, so free from mortal taint. Anon his heart revives, her vespers done, of all its wreathed pearls her hair she frees, unclasps her warmed jewels one by one, loosens her fragrant bodice by degrees. Her rich attire creeps rustling to her knees, half hidden like a mermaid in seaweed. Pensive awhile she dreams awake, and sees in fancy fair St. Agnes in her bed, but dares not look behind, or all the charm is fled. The Eve of St. Agnes. Welcome back to Professing Literature. We are coming to you from Oklahoma City in the year of grace 2024. And of course, Professing Literature is the podcast where we look closely at short passages of important works of literature in the hopes of seeing writers in action. We aim here to work across literary genres and modes, whether comedy or tragedy, drama, poetry, or fiction, looking at the dynamics of a passage in order to understand what the author is doing and what is at stake for the work as a whole, the issues that it clarifies, the techniques that are involved. I am David Anderson. I'm a professor of Renaissance literature at the University of Oklahoma in the Department of Classics and Letters. And today, as always, I am joined by producer Eric Williams. I am just going to dive in because this is the second part of a two-parter. I will say along the way, please, if you're a fan of what we do, we would love it if you would subscribe. Most of you already do this, but if you haven't, please subscribe to your service of choice, and please give us a rating and even a review, because that's very handy for us as we try to ascend the podcast mountain. But I'm just going to tackle Keats. I'm going to assume that if you're with us right now, you've listened to part one of our two-parter on Keats's poem. If you haven't, I think you'd probably find it a more satisfying experience to start there. I'm not going to tell anyone what to do, so if you're just determined to start with part two, then that's all right. But if you want a brief sort of setup discussion of John Keats and a little bit of the Romantic movement and of the stanza form that Keats uses in this poem, you should check in with the last episode. But anyway, right now we are continuing on with our conversation about Keats's stunning narrative romance. Once upon a time, there was a great castle on a very cold night. Inside the castle, a great feast taking place with many visitors. A young man and a young woman are going to meet. Their families are deadly rivals. He will be killed if he's discovered on the premises. He snuck into the castle, aided by her old maid, who is his only ally. His name is Porphyro. Her name is Madeline. Madeline is in the middle of preparations that she's undertaken with a lot of thought, and she is going to perform the folk ritual associated with the Eve of St. Agnes on the 20th of January. Agnes had been a Diocletian martyr in the late Roman Empire, went to her death in the year 304 AD, and she became the patron saint of virgins. Madeline is not interested in St. Agnes as a figure of piety, however. Madeline is captivated by an old folk tradition which had been current in the Middle Ages, long before Keats wrote the poem, in the British Isles. In Keats's version, well, in the folk tale, or in the folk tradition, I should say, a maiden, so an unmarried virgin, may be given a dream of her future husband on the eve of St. Agnes' Day, if she undertakes the ritual properly. In Keats's poem, that means Madeline has to do a couple of things. She has to go to bed without supper. Shouldn't be too big a deal. But she has to go to bed also without looking behind her. And if she does this, then St. Agnes may intercede by giving her a vision of her future husband. Obviously, this has nothing to do with Christian devotion and everything to do with a romantic spirit and with someone who is besotted with the idea of love. And so Madeline is going to undertake this regimen, and she is going to hope for a vision of her husband. But in fact, she's going to get the real thing, because she doesn't know that Porphyro has been hidden in her room. She doesn't look behind her and go to her closet where she might see Porphyro. He is there, ready to woo her, and when she goes to sleep, he will emerge, and eventually she will awake and find him. And so it will not be a dream, it will be him. And so they will flee together at the end of the poem, as we'll see. For Keats, just to rehearse a very little bit of sort of the essence of the earlier episode, for Keats, this act is one that symbolizes, I think we can say, the artistic experience at its purest. Does Keats love the story and the idea? Well, of course he does. I think he finds it fascinating and beautiful. But he's also he's chosen this story and constructed a poem around it because what Madeline and Porphyro are doing represents to him the experience of beauty. Last time we compared what happens in this poem, or sort of read what happens in this poem through, loosely, Keats's theory of negative capability. And I quoted from his letter where he talks about this term that he's just coined in the letter. Negative capability is something, he says, that the greatest geniuses possess. And he says it is when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. So to be content with mystery, to explore as an artist an idea or an image or a story, not because it is a problem to be solved or not because it is a vehicle for a particular moral, but because the thing itself, in all of its mystery, is simply to be beheld. So this is Keats's theory of great art. It also helps orient us towards the poem and suggests that we as readers are simply to experience the poem and not to question technical issues or moral questions. They aren't there to be resolved. Keats raises moral problems in this poem. The biggest one, I think, is whether Porphyro is a creep or a great romantic hero. But we aren't supposed to come to a firm conclusion in this poem. We're supposed to merely be captivated by these lovers and in sympathy with the choices they make. So we are not to come down with a verdict. And we're not even really, I think, from Keats's perspective, to ask what the poem means. So when I say negative capability is sort of our loose framework for thinking about it, that needs to be a kind of admonition I give to myself, that it's not that in conclusion this poem therefore demonstrates Keats's understanding of artistry, which he sums up with the term negative capability. It's just a helpful way, I think, of maybe appreciating what's going on here, and a bit of a caution that we are not supposed to anatomize the Eve of St. Agnes, but just to behold it. So, you heard all that last time at greater length if you listened to the episode, and now we'll get cooking. Last time I explained that my mode of going through this poem, and this is actually something I've done in the classroom a couple of times when I've taught this poem, rather than try to digest the whole thing and work through it. It's too long a poem for that. It's 42 9-line stanzas. Rather than doing that, I'm going to zero in on 4 pairs of stanzas. And so in the previous episode, you only got 2 because my setup was so long. So in this one, I'm going to cover the other 3 pairs of stanzas, working chronologically. So in the first episode, we looked at the introductory stanzas of the poem, which describe not Madeline or Porphyro, but the beadsman. The poem starts with this figure, the beadsman, this quasi-monastic figure, this almsman who's praying the rosary in the dark, frigid chapel. He is a figure of traditional piety. But for Keats, his is a lifeless, empty piety. And the exterior cold of the night, which Keats brings home so vividly, signifies the beadsman's interior cold. He is a kind of figure of impotence and doesn't even seem to have conviction in what he's doing. He is set up to contrast with what will follow, because what follows is youth, vitality, color, warmth, and beauty. So we're going to continue on, and I'm going to jump ahead to stanzas 25 and 26. So we have been introduced to our 2 protagonists. We've been given a sketch of Madeline's intentions. There's the great scene of the ball going on in the castle that Madeline herself is utterly indifferent to. And we've seen Porphyro enter the castle, meet Angela, this woman he knows who happens to be friendly to him, the only person he can trust in this hostile castle. And he's smuggled in to Madeline's bedchamber. And so we're going to, as I say, look first at stanzas 25 and 26, and these are the ones I read at the top of the episode. Initially, when I was doing my preparation for this recording, usually I like to take a passage when I'm just doing a single lyric poem, or in this case, narrative poem. I like to take a passage from another work of poetry written by the poet, and I was going to do Keats's poem Fancy, which is written 1818, a year before the Eve of St. Agnes. But it's too long a poem, and I just thought after working through these 3 pairs of stanzas, that would be just over-egging the pudding, as they say in Britain. And so I just began the episode with stanzas 25 and 26, and I'll read them again now and then get talking about them. So, Madeline has entered her bedchamber. She is not looking behind her, and she is saying her prayers. The beadsman, of course, had been praying, and his prayers were it was implied that his prayers were ineffectual and kind of vacuous. The nature of Madeline's prayers are a little more ambiguous, I think, and what she's really wanting is not the salvation of her soul or world peace. What she's wanting is that St. Agnes will grant this vision of her future husband. But Keats here is mostly interested. He's not interested in reading Madeline's mind. It's clear enough. He's interested, first of all, in the way she looks, and the way he describes her is glorious. So, to read these stanzas again. Full on this casement shone the wintry moon, and threw warm gules on Madeline's fair breast, as down she knelt for heaven's grace and boon. Rose bloom fell on her hands together pressed, and on her silver cross soft amethyst, and on her hair a glory like a saint. She seemed a splendid angel, newly dressed save wings for heaven. Porphyro grew faint. She knelt so pure a thing, so free from mortal taint. Anon his heart revives, her vespers done, of all its wreathed pearls her hair she frees, unclasps her warmed jewels one by one, loosens her fragrant bodice, by degrees her rich attire creeps rustling to her knees. Half hidden, like a mermaid in seaweed, pensive awhile she dreams awake and sees in fancy fair St. Agnes in her bed, but dares not look behind, or all the charm is fled. So those are stanzas 25 and 26, 18 lines of poetry. I talked last time about the richness of Keats's language and of his imagery, and we see it here and then some. She is preparing for bed, and preparing, she hopes, to have this vision, and so she does not look behind her. She is content with mystery. Porphyro is watching her. So she is kneeling before the casement, and the windows in the casement that she's praying before seem to be stained glass windows, because they throw warm gules on her fair breast. The word gules is a word from the medieval tradition of heraldry, and it means red. And so it seems that there's glass in the window that is red-colored. And so the wintry moon is shining on the casement. The moon, of course, is a symbol of femininity, classically, and in some cases you could say a symbol of virginity, because the goddess Artemis or Diana or Cynthia in the Greco-Roman tradition is the goddess also of virginity as well as the moon. And so the wintry moon, that word wintry, both reminding us of the cold night, also perhaps suggesting something about the sort of icy white color of the moon. However, that white light is transmuted as it passes through the glass, because the light as it shines on Madeline has been transmuted, passing through the window. And so shades of red fall upon her. And so we have the white lunar symbol of virginity, but as it passes through this window, the colors change and we have warm reds. I don't think I need to draw too detailed a diagram to pull out the implication of the warm red light, the warm gules shining on her breast. But notice the tensions in this stanza, because the language on one hand the stanza is full of religious language and religious implications, medieval Catholic, but on the other hand, those implications they're challenged or undercut by the red color that falls upon her. And so there's the red light falling on her breast. She kneels down for heaven's grace and boon. So she is in a posture of prayer and supplication. She's beseeching heaven for something, although what she wants from heaven is that St. Agnes would grant her request to have this vision. And so as a prayer, certainly from a kind of traditional Christian perspective, as a prayer, it's kind of a compromised prayer, because this is not, one would think, according to traditional piety, a proper subject of prayer, to have this sort of gratuitous, you could say, vision of one's future husband. So there's something compromising in the prayer, perhaps, and the red light keeps coloring her and parts of her in ways that suggest a compromise or something else. That may be a word that has undue pejorative implications in the context of this poem. But see what happens. She's kneeling down, seeking heaven, heaven's grace and boon. But in the next line, Keats says again, we've already heard of the gules that have been thrown on her breast. Now he says, rose bloom fell on her hands together pressed. So her hands are in a posture of prayer, but they are lit up by red-colored light. On her cross, which is silver, linking us to that wintry moon, and silver is the color of Diana, of Artemis, of moonlight, of that sort of, with all of the virginal associations. But on the silver cross, obvious symbol of piety, we have the light falling in as soft amethyst. And then as Keats continues the stanza, he explains that of Madeline's gorgeous hair, on her hair a glory like a saint. So the moonlight coming through the window as it lights upon her hair seems to create almost a halo effect. But notice that Keats says, like a saint. You know, of course, she's not a saint, but that word like, announcing the simile, also suggests perhaps that she only seems to have the halo sheen of a saint. And I might be overreading that line if in the following line he didn't say she seemed a splendid angel, newly dressed save wings for heaven. So she is like a saint, and she seems an angel. But that is not what she is. She's not a figure of devotion. She's a figure of desire. She is both desirable, and Keats heightens the sense of her desirability in these stanzas, and she's also desiring. And so she has these sort of external markers that seem to be, or that can be in the medieval tradition, saintly markers. But that's not what's going on here. She is desirable and desiring. She is virginal, but she is also at the point where she no longer desires to be virginal. And so in the last line of the stanza, this 12-line Alexandrine, Keats says, she knelt so pure a thing, so free from mortal taint. So that is the way she appears, but that light has, taint seems a strong word. That light, taint implies pollution, but that light has certainly colored her and qualified her devotional appearance. And so there are ambiguities here that have to do with Madeline's status, with her intentions, with the question of her apparent purity. And those ambiguities are only going to continue and going to multiply. Porphyro grows faint watching this because she perhaps is so saintly in appearance, and or perhaps because she is so desirable. And so does the fainting quality come from the fact that she seems to be so pure, therefore challenging his intentions, or is it rather that he is just growing faint with desire for her? Anyway, in the following stanza, we are told his heart revives, and her vespers, her evening prayers, are finished. And then we have this extraordinary description of her preparation for bed. And the lushness of Keats's description is remarkable. So we are told, of all its wreathed pearls, her hair she frees. So this image of the beautiful noblewoman with pearls in her hair is a wonderful one. But notice that she's freeing her hair from those pearls, and the pearls also perhaps have something of that lunar white quality of virginity. That might be going too far, but the image of the woman taking the pearls out of her hair and letting her hair down is a strong one. And of course, in Keats's England, just as in the Middle Ages, for the most part, the woman, once she has attained sort of physical maturity, is supposed to keep her hair up in public. And Madeline has just been attending a ball, albeit a ball that she wasn't paying any attention to. And so, you know, you may have the experience sometimes of watching a film set in Victorian England or something like that, and, you know, there will be a bedroom scene, a domestic scene, and this woman that we've only seen with her hair up all of a sudden has her hair down. And, you know, as viewers, because we're used to seeing her with her hair down, whether it's Jane Eyre or whoever else, it's kind of striking to see the woman with her hair down in this traditional culture. It's an intimate thing. It's only in the 20th century that it becomes standard practice for the woman to have her hair down in public if she chooses. There's something very intimate and sort of erotic about Madeline letting her hair down and taking the pearls out. And then we have this wonderful line that follows. She unclasps her warmed jewels one by one. So she's taking off, I suppose, her necklaces and her various bangles and things like that, her bracelets, but just the way he notes that they are warmed because of her body heat is such, it's just a brilliant detail and also a suggestive one. We are told she loosens her bodice and then by degrees her dress comes down off of her shoulders to her knees. He doesn't tell us if she's in a shift or something like that. I would assume she would be and is not in her birthday suit. But he doesn't tell us that and probably wants us to wonder. But the description of her with her dress about the lower part of her legs is another stunner. She is half hidden like a mermaid in seaweed. Now, a long, long time ago, when we were talking about the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot, I talked about mermaids. And so to describe Madeline as a mermaid, it's kind of, you know, it's sort of a perfect image if you think of the sort of silhouette of her upper body tapering down to this pile of brocaded silk below her knees. It gives us that kind of sort of mermaid-esque silhouette. But of course, if you remember from Prufrock, the mermaid is a seductress. And so Madeline isn't intending any seduction here. She is hoping to be given a vision, and she will really be the one who, in this poem, is seduced by Porphyro. But by figuring her as a mermaid, Keats is drawing our attention to the seductive nature, albeit unintentional, of this portrait. While she stands by the window, Keats says, pensive awhile she dreams awake, so she daydreams, and sees in fancy fair St. Agnes in her bed. So she imagines, she's not having a hallucination or a vision or anything like that. This is her fancy, her imagination. But she imagines that she sees St. Agnes in her bed, the Virgin Martyr. And so this is going to, this only seems to be further inducing her to commit herself to this process. Madeline may beseech St. Agnes's aid, and she may follow the rituals associated with St. Agnes Eve, but she is not St. Agnes. And finally, this stanza concludes by reminding us again of her imperative not to look behind. She dares not look behind, or all the charm is fled. Now, again, if she dares to look behind, she very well may see Porphyro watching her from hiding. You can imagine that would break the charm, potentially at least. He is going to work very carefully and get everything arranged just so and wake her up from her dream. Whether or not she would shriek and call for the castle guards if she sees them in this moment, we can't be sure, but we can understand how the charm would be broken if she sees him now, and so she does not look behind. And as I say, her commitment to not being an Orpheus, to not looking behind her, is a sort of encapsulation of this Keatsian idea of surrendering to mystery and to the unknown. We'll move ahead and look at stanzas 36 and 37 now. So Porphyro has watched Madeline prepare for bed. She gets in bed and she falls asleep, and he goes to work. And as I said last time, he's brought a picnic basket with him. And so he lays out this gorgeous feast, which Keats has a lot of fun describing, these luxurious foods, and prepares to awaken her, having gotten everything just right, and sings to her. And so he sings her awake, which is a great detail. Of course, he doesn't just grab her by the shoulder and shake her and say, "Madeline, Madeline, wake up. It's me." Instead, he sings her awake, and she sees that it's him, and she is shocked, but she is also enthralled. And so he sings to her, and that awakens her. And Keats says, that she still beheld now wide awake the vision of her sleep. And so she sees before her the thing that she had been presumably seeing in her dream, or at least wanting to see. But Keats says there was a painful change, and it makes her weep, because the dream has become reality, and the potential has been actualized beyond what she ever expected, or what St. Agnes promises to her devotees, because a real man is now before her. And there is a sense of Madeline being stirred by this, but also daunted by it. And so there's a heightening here of the moral ambiguity that I have described. Again, I am not recommending Porphyro as a model for young men to emulate, because the problems that come with this bedroom escapade are obvious, and Madeline is daunted by them. Porphyro intends no compulsion here. We don't, I think, have any hint of this, but he is eager and forward-pressing, and she is checked and worried. And so she weeps, and she sees him, and she notes how pallid and chill he is, because he's come in from the blasted heath on this wintry night. He doesn't look like the radiant, rosy-cheeked Porphyro that she beheld in her dream. The real is encroaching upon her dream. And so we're told that she still stares at him. She would on him her gaze keep, as he kneels before her in supplication. But she is fearful. She's fearful that he may be sick, dying, wounded, something like that. And she's also fearful, I think, of the change that is impending in her life. At this point, we have stanzas 36 and 37, which I'll now read, because Porphyro hears all of this, and it seems to intensify his love and certainly his desire. So, after she speaks to him, we are told, "Beyond a mortal man impassioned far, at these voluptuous accents he arose, ethereal, flushed, and like a throbbing star seen mid the sapphire heaven's deep repose. Into her dream he melted, as the rose blendeth its odor with the violet, solution sweet, Meantime the frost wind blows, like love's alarum pattering the sharp sleet against the window panes. St. Agnes' moon hath set. 'Tis dark, quick pattereth the flaw-blown sleet. This is no dream, my bride, my Madeline. 'Tis dark, the iced gusts still rave and beat. No dream, alas, alas, and woe is mine. Porphyro will leave me here to fade and pine. Cruel, what traitor could thee hither bring? I curse not, for my heart is lost in thine, though thou forsakest a deceived thing, a dove forlorn and lost with sick unpruned wing. So he has sung her awake, and she is unsettled, and as she speaks to him, he is emboldened, impassioned at her voluptuous accents. Again, I don't think that Madeline is being positioned here as a seductress, but it seems that anything she says, whether intended or not, will seduce Porphyro because of the state he's in. And so the sexual implications of the description of him as ethereal, flushed, and like a throbbing star, I do not think need my unpacking. They're obvious enough. He is aroused, excited, impassioned, as Keats says at this. And so Keats doesn't describe exactly what happens. He leaves it to us to imagine. When Keats says, "Into her dream he melted," that could simply mean that there is a kind of merging in her mind now of the actual Porphyro with the dream vision Porphyro. But it could also, and I think does, suggest their sexual coming together. He comes into her dream, and Keats uses the imagery of scent, olfactory imagery, describing their coming together, or the coming together of the real and the dream, as like the rose's scent being mingled with that of the violet. The blending of the scents is a way of evoking the idea of their coming together, of physical union. It's also a way of describing, or of sort of sketching, the experience of the poem as a whole that I've been talking about. We're in terrain now where sharp clarity between one thing and another, between most obviously right and wrong, is difficult to discern. The odors are blended here. If you're in a hothouse or a room that's full of roses and violets, you smell both of those things. If you just inhale through your nose, you can't separate the smell of rose from violet. Instead, they become one scent. And so borders dissolve in this image. And that seems to indicate what's happening in the poem. However, at this point, after he has risen up and come to her, and then we have the image of the blending scents, we have a sharp disruption, both in terms of their experience together and also our experience of the stanza, which up until this point in the seventh line has been one of sort of gorgeousness and luxury. Now we have what Keats calls the alarum. And so what happens, we are told, is that the frost wind blows sleet against the window, against that very window that Madeline had been kneeling before. And so there's a disruption caused, and you can almost hear it in your mind if you know what I'm talking about, that tiny tick-tick of icy snow beginning to fall against a glass window. And so the wind here is blowing hard, and so it's coming in, and so it's blowing the sleet hard, and so they can hear it. I think what we've got here is something akin to the lark scene in Romeo and Juliet after they have been married and then spent the night together. They hear the birds singing, which is this classic medieval troubadour alarm clock that warns the lover that he's got to do like Romeo and jump out the window. Romeo and Juliet are married, but Romeo is not supposed to be marrying Juliet, and he's also being sought by the authorities for Tybalt's death, and so he's got to get out of Verona after this one night with his new bride. And so the bird call reminds them that the night is ending and that he's got to scram. And so the frost wind is doing the thing here. It is love's alarum. And so St. Agnes moon hath set, we're told at the end of the stanza. Remember that was the moon that had been shining through the stained glass on Madeline. And it also tells us that St. Agnes Eve is over. And that means perhaps that Porphyro, the vision, is now going to disappear. That's what Madeline assumes. But that's not what's going to happen. Instead, what it really means is that the St. Agnes phase, I suppose, of Madeline's life is over. And things are going to be different now. Perhaps it is because she has attained kind of adulthood through this experience, maturity. And it's also because she and Porphyro are together now. And Keats is going to keep them together, at least through the end of the poem, and suggests, as we will see, that they will face the world together. And so Madeline assumes the worst. She hears the sleet blowing against the window. She perhaps notices that the moon has set. This means that the blending of, to put it delicately, the blending of the rose with the violet has taken some time. Some time has passed. And so he has to get moving. He can't be found in the castle. And so she understands this as an emotional disaster for her. He is going to have to leave, she imagines, to leave her. And so she assumes that she's going to be a forgotten woman. He tells her that this is no dream. And that has the sense that she may have half wondered in what has just happened as to whether she was still dreaming, the fact that he has to tell her this is no dream. He calls her my bride, implying that he sees what has happened as being definitive for them, that they are married. Keats would know very well that in the medieval world, there was a tradition sometimes referred to as hand fasting, whereby a young man and a young woman could be considered married without a priest, any kind of formal ceremony, if they simply plight their troth, if they simply exchange vows of fidelity and then consummate the marriage sexually, that they are married. They are supposed to do it in front of witnesses, which these two do not. But I think we're supposed to take Porphyro seriously when he calls her my bride. He sees this as being a definitive thing. In the medieval world, if you hand fasted and became married, you were expected at some point in the near future to go before a priest and have the marriage sort of finally formalized in church, or I guess before the church door in some cases. I don't know if these two have any interest or intention of having a priest offer them the sacrament of holy matrimony, but Porphyro believes that Madeline is his bride, and she doubts that, but he is sincere in it. She says, no dream, alas, alas, and woe is mine. Porphyro will leave me here to fade and pine. And so she imagines this as an act of treachery, that she has been fooled, not because he has taken advantage of her, but because having slept with her, he is now going to leave her. And so she believes she will be forsaken, and that She will be the classic pining woman who has now she's now no longer a virgin and believes that she's being left behind by her lover, that he has simply taken advantage of her. She says, I curse not, for my heart is lost in thine. And that phrase brings us back to the olfactory image of the sense of the two flowers mingling, the idea of one thing being lost in another, or two things being lost in each other, is echoed when she says, my heart is lost in thine. And so she's saying, I don't hate you for this, but I'm suffering a cruel fate because you're going to leave me, and you're doing something cruel because I'm a dove forlorn with an injured wing. And so I'm now compromised. I can't marry another man, even if her parents never know about this, which presumably they wouldn't, even if she could keep it a secret. She can't marry another man. He is her husband, as she imagines it, but he's going to leave. That's not what he's going to do. He is going to leave the castle and take her with him. The storm has awoken them to their situation. It's their alarm clock. It is perhaps reality coming in, although I think that's maybe going too far. Porphyro describes the storm through further images of uncertainty and mystery. It's not for him that the storm sort of conjures up the real world that they've got to come to terms with. Rather, he says it's an elfin storm from fairyland, of haggard seeming but a boon indeed. So it seems to be haggard seeming, it seems to be a curse, dark magic. But this storm, this elfin storm from fairyland, is really a blessing, because it's going to help us escape from the castle and make it harder for us to be pursued. He may be wrong about this, but it's hard to tell. He might not be wrong about it. And so the storm from this account is picking up where the dream left off, because the storm, like the dream, like the ritual that Madeline undergoes, is another state of uncertainty. The state of uncertainty will continue in the storm. It is perhaps a darker state of uncertainty, and again, Madeline is no longer a virgin. Both exaggerate at this point, because Madeline speaks as if they're already ruined and she's already had her heart broken. Porphyro talks as if they're already safely married and have begun living happily ever after. And they repeat that phrase in the stanza I read, that phrase. It seems that they both use the phrase, 'tis dark, 'tis dark. And that seems to be an assertion of this state of mystery. The whole poem is dark, although it's lit up with these brilliant flashes of color. And we don't know exactly how to construe what we're experiencing. Moving ahead to the final two stanzas of the poem, stanzas 41 and 42. So they are making their way out of the castle. Madeline is going to go away with Porphyro, and good luck to them, I suppose. We are not given a sequel to this poem, and so we'll never know what happened to them. We'll never know if their lives are blissful or difficult or nasty, brutish, and short. But we are told that they leave the castle together. So he will not leave her. They'll go away together. So stanzas 41 and 42 describe the exit from the castle and a little bit of the aftermath within the castle. Keats says, they glide like phantoms into the wide hall, like phantoms to the iron porch they glide, where lay the porter in uneasy sprawl with a huge empty flagon by his side. The wakeful bloodhound rose and shook his hide, but his sagacious eye an inmate owns. By one and one the bolts full easy slide, the chains lie silent on the foot-worn stones, the key turns, and the door upon its hinges groans. And they are gone. Aye, ages long ago these lovers fled away into the storm. That night the Baron dreamt of many a woe, and all his warrior guests with shade and form of witch and demon and large coffin worm were long benightmared. Angela the old died palsy-twitched, with meagre face deform. The beadsman, after 1,000 aves told, for aye unsought for, slept among his ashes cold. It's a stunning ending to a stunning poem. First of all, we have Madeline and Porphyro in contrast to all the other inhabitants of the castle. Everyone else is asleep. Even the porter, who is supposed to be guarding the door, has drunk himself to sleep. They alone are awake, although they're described not as running out, but as gliding like phantoms. They're phantoms, or they're like phantoms, almost existing in an alternate reality to the grim, hard reality of this castle. The only other creature that is awake is the bloodhound that sleeps by the porter at the door. But the bloodhound is not a problem. The bloodhound recognizes Madeline. Sorry, I'm doing business. He doesn't bark and bay and give her away. He knows who she is, and so he isn't a problem. He's the only one they encounter who's aware of them. Notice how Keats describes the gates of the castle opening. I'll read it again. By one and one the bolts full easy slide. The chains lie silent on the foot-worn stones. The key turns and the door upon its hinges groans. So he does not say, Porphyro undid the bolts on the door, and Madeline turned the key, and they opened the door. Rather, this seems to be something that happens of its own accord. The castle seems to let them out and release them. Keats isn't saying that that's what's happening, and he doesn't want us to understand that that's what's happening, but the way he describes them unbolting the gates and opening them suggest, imply, that they are simply being released. And so off they go. And the final stanza says, they are gone, aye, ages long ago. So this happened a long time. The lovers fled away into the storm. He doesn't say, the lovers reached such and such a place. They got to Porphyro's home territory, or they went to the big city, or anything like that, and rented an apartment. It's nothing like that. They fled away into the storm. That's all we're told. So we lose them in the storm, which, as I've suggested, seems to be yet another symbol of mystery, that it just sort of takes them and carries them away, we know not whither. And that's the last we hear of them, is them fleeing into the storm. And the remainder of the stanza, the 7 lines that remain in the stanza, describe the other inhabitants of the castle, and it's not pretty. Madeline and Porphyro are these figures of mystery that slip away. They flee into the storm as the rose mingles its odor with the violet, to call back to that image. They escape, and we don't know what happens to them. What we do know of the Baron and his guests and other inhabitants of the castle is not pleasant. The Baron is Madeline's father, the crusty old heavy father who would be outraged and bloodthirstily furious if he knew what had gone on in his house. He has dark dreams and nightmares, and so do all his guests, his warrior guests. Their dreams are haunted by shade and form of witch and demon and large coffin worm, Keats says, and it's, just fantastic phrasing, that they were long benightmared. So they twist and writhe for hours in these tormenting dreams, as Madeline and Porphyro have escaped. Now, just to remind you of what you already know, at no point is it suggested, I think, that Madeline and Porphyro do anything especially virtuous, although I suppose there is some virtue in their fidelity to one another that they seem to both want to maintain. But they're not rewarded for their virtue by escaping the sort of curse that seems to hang over the castle. They simply flee it together and are free of it. Now, I don't know about you, but running off into a terrible storm on this dreadfully cold night doesn't seem to me to be guarantee of future happiness. Maybe Porphyro has a horse a mile or so away, hidden in a little thicket or something, and they can get on their way, but we're not told that. That's just me speculating goofily. Instead, what we are told is that this curse seems to hang over the castle, and so all the inhabitants are tormented, though Madeline and Porphyro escape from it. The woman who had helped them come together, Angela, the old woman who is Madeline's maid, is forgotten. There's no mention by Madeline and Porphyro of her. She has come to the limit of her usefulness, and so she's forgotten, and we're told that night she died palsy-twitched. And so there's a kind of punishment for her. There's a punishment for all of them, I suppose. Yes, here's what I think. It's not that Madeline and Porphyro are virtuous, but the other figures in the castle seem to be those who expect certainty. The Baron expects, obviously, continued hostility with Porphyro's family and continued obedience from the one he presumes is his still virginal daughter. And his warrior guests are clearly aligned with him. Angela had been the one who had helped Porphyro enter the bedchamber, but she's also very much presented in stanzas that we didn't touch on as a figure of fear. She's terrified that she's going to get into trouble, that disaster is going to come. And disaster does come to her, although not because Madeline and Porphyro have been discovered, but she dies palsy-twitched with meager face, deformed. And, she had sort of embodied this kind of simple reflex to sort of conservative safety, and she dies. And then the beadsman, who we're now reminded of, the beadsman with whom we began the poem, we're now told of, that he also dies this night. After 1,000 Aves told, 1,000 Hail Marys, he's told on his beads, but he dies. He sleeps among his ashes cold. And so that last word, the figure of the beadsman and also the very last word of the stanza and the poem, cold, take us back to where we began the poem. As the beadsman sat in the frigid chapel in the cold, telling his rosary beads with fingers so numb that he could barely feel them, unable to imagine the kind of faith that would let him hope the best for these people that he's praying for. And so he seems to die also and is forever unsought as he lies in his ashes cold. In other words, no one cares enough to go looking for the poor beadsman. He is forgotten. And so Madeline and Porphyro have come together in love and escaped together in love, and they don't have assurance of success or future happiness, but they are contrasted with these other figures. They make assumptions and they make predictions, some of which within the poem are proven wrong, but they seem to flourish in uncertainty, and so off they go. I think that will be where I end here with our conversation of this poem, and I hope it's not too unsatisfying an ending. It is a hard poem to get a grip on, but I do think it is demanding of us a certain kind of unexpected readerly discipline, or at least a readerly discipline that is maybe unexpected in our era, where we are not meant to solve this thing, but simply to appreciate it as both a description of a kind of embrace of mystery and uncertainty, but also as a work of art that demands that very thing from us. So, I'll bid you farewell now. I'm David Anderson on behalf of Eric Williams. Thank you for listening.